Hello, welcome to Sophie & Co. I'm Sophie Shevardnadze. After openly interfering in a protest that toppled the government, the U.S. is now Ukraine's #1 partner. We're making lots of promises. But the future is still murky for Kiev, so just how far is Washington willing to take its involvement? Well, today we talked to an ex-CIA officer who, after 3 decades of intelligence experience, became a political activist and a whistleblower. Ray McGovern joins me today.
Ukraine is being buffeted by the headwinds of revolution. A new wave of protests in the east hold a real chance of open civil conflict. Will the US rush to the aid of its new friends in Kiev? Or will Ukraine be left to fend for itself? How far can Washington go before it hits the wall of Russian interests?
Ray McGovern, retired CIA analyst, whistleblower, political activist. It's really great to have you on our show today. So we're going to talk about Ukraine as usual. Just recently, United States, Russia, and the EU have agreed to sit down with Ukraine in an attempt to resolve this crisis. But is this a problem to be solved internationally, or should it all be? Is it an internal Ukrainian issue? As a matter of fact, was it ever Ukraine's internal problem?
Well, Ukraine obviously needs to be involved intimately. We can't have the EU and the US and Russia deciding the future of the Ukraine. So the answer is the Ukrainians need to be involved intimately, but all of them, East and West. And I'm really glad that the adults have taken over now, and that what should have happened several weeks ago is happening now. People getting together to figure out how to do this where no one's security is endangered.
Well, like you've said, all these adults have different goals, and it seems like finding common ground isn't really among them. What's the real point of these talks?
Well, if this were a matter of national security for the United States of America, that would be true. It is not a matter of national security. It's a matter of living up to the promise that was made to Gorbachev and your grandfather Shevardnadze in 1990 when James Baker said the U.S. and NATO would not leapfrog over Germany, would not move NATO 1 inch eastward. Now, that was a solemn promise. Unfortunately, it wasn't written down, but when your leaders, Russian leaders, saw that NATO started infringing, started going eastward, and then, of course, when NATO leaders decided 6 years ago in Bucharest that Georgia and the Ukraine would become members of NATO, that was sort of the last straw until the provocations that happened on the Maidan in Kiev.
Right, but I think NATO is a point that Russia will never negotiate on. So if all sides are not willing to compromise, could the talks eventually make things worse? Because from what I understand, there are some unnegotiable points.
Well, yes, Russia has an unnegotiable point. NATO will not subsume Ukraine under NATO's wing. That is entirely understandable. As Helmut Schmidt, the former former German Bundeskanzler said, it is durchaus verständlich, or it's thoroughly understandable that Russia is not going to let Ukraine become part of NATO. And I think what the administration here in Washington decided was, well, we'll try it anyway, and they got a bloody nose. So I think there being no security interests of any importance on the U.S. side, finally Obama is able to say, yes, we'll talk, we'll negotiate, we'll include, of course, the Ukrainians, but the EU, Russia, we, and the Ukrainians will figure it all out. It's not difficult to figure out unless you want to make regime change in Ukraine. And that was of course, the casus belli, so to speak, when our Assistant Secretary of State made it clear in that intercepted telephone conversation that Yats is our guy, and that he's, he used to be or still is the head of the central bank. He knows about austerity. He'll know about what needs to happen for the IMF, and the whole business about subsuming Ukraine into the EU or its economic umbrella. you know, they would end up just like the workers in Greece, cheap labor with incredible debt to have to pay off. So I think that people are sort of calming down now. I really fear for what Putin called the neo-Nazis and the Bandera groups. They are still around, so we need to make sure that jointly we don't let them disrupt whatever peace negotiations.
Right. So you touched
transpire.
upon a couple of different points that are involved in the Ukrainian crisis. Let's start with the financial problem. The Western financial help comes with conditions, like you've said, and they're likely to hurt average Ukrainian, well, at least in the nearest future. Do you see a danger of another social explosion after austerity starts?
Well, if things go through, you know, I'm not at all sure that this interim government is going to last very long. But if Russia sits back and says, all right, well, no more discounts on our natural gas, and if the West wants to come through with $18 billion to bail out Ukraine, that's fine with us. But the Russians, your people, still have incredible power that comes of the economic leverage that comes from natural gas and oil, and the very close ties between Russia and, for example, Germany, that are new. And that if the U.S. thinks that it can leverage these things, I think the U.S. is in for a sad awakening.
Since you've touched upon the gas, the United States is actually telling Ukraine that it can make that country independent from Russia in terms of gas. But U.S. shale gas project is something still to come in the future. It's not there yet. Do you feel like they're giving them empty promises?
Well, you know, it's not going to happen anytime soon. The idea there is to you Ukrainians, you know, get extra blankets now. And if you can just last a couple of years with extra blankets, we'll get these liquefied natural gas ships built, and we'll get the shale oil going, and you'll be all right. Just wait a couple of years. It's ridiculous on its face. Russia has the high cards here. The Ukrainians have to know that. So does the EU, the rest of Europe.
So you don't think that America can actually follow through its promise to make Ukraine independent from Russian gas?
It's physically impossible for the next few years.
Mm-hmm. So here's another thing. Only 1 out of 6 Americans can actually point Ukraine on a map. Some even think they live in Ukraine, according to a recent Washington Post survey. So why do some want to take action in a place they know nothing about?
Well, that's very simple. It's the media in our country which is beating the drums for a hostile attitude toward the United States. I'm sorry, towards Russia. Now, the background of that, of course, is that the people who control the media are the ones that profiteer from arms manufacturing and sales. They're also the people who do not want decent relations between Russia and the United States. Victoria Nuland, for example. The cardinal sin that Vladimir Putin made was to help the United States out of a very difficult situation with respect to Syria. The point is, Putin bailed out the president. The people who wanted the war to continue in Syria, the neocons, were distraught about that. And so they don't like Putin one bit, and they want to cause a hostile relationship between Russia and the United States. But Obama and Putin do have a relationship, and I can see that working out for the better as people sit down as adults and negotiate this crisis.
But it's funny, you mentioned the neocons, because I was talking to Ron Paul recently, and he also told me kind of same thing. He said that it's the hardliners at home who are influencing Obama, and they're the ones who want heavy American involvement in Ukraine. But why would they want that?
Well, for two reasons. One is because they want to create this hostile environment between Moscow and Washington. That helps arms sales. That helps arms sales to the former East European countries. It helps stir up the kind of spirit that makes defense expenditures even more. The other reason is they do not like to have a relationship where Vladimir Putin and our president, Barack Obama, are able to negotiate behind the back of their favorite neocon. And their favorite neocon is the fellow I mentioned before, John Kerry, who has the neocon attitude where they think that the strategic interests of Israel on the one side are identical with the strategic interests of the United States on the other side. Now, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. I just don't think those kinds of people should be running U.S. policy, and I think the President Obama, should fire John Kerry now that it's very clear that he lied 35 times on August 30th by saying that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for those chemical attacks. That was a lie. Vladimir Putin had it right.
Do you think the American politicians now dealing with the Ukrainian crisis are fully aware of how divided the nation is?
No, of course they are, to the degree they take any interest. Now, your allusion to the recent poll, which shows that very few Americans can identify where Ukraine is on the map, it was very interesting. Not only does that go for American citizens, it goes for our Congress people as well. And there was a direct correlation. Those who thought that the Ukraine was perhaps in Asia or in the middle of the sea thought, yes, we should take a very strong attitude and maybe even consider military action against it. But those who knew where Ukraine is, right in the shadow of Russia, were much more judicious, much more enlightened, and saw that we have no need to mess around to cause regime change in Kiev, and so they are much less in favor of a strong military-type response.
All right, we're going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll be talking to Ray McGovern, retired CIA analyst and whistleblower, and we'll talk more on what's in store for Ukraine in the aftermath of a revolution. Stay with us.
Zero tolerance is the idea that for a particular misbehavior, the schools will have no discretion. Personally, I think it's a foolish idea.
The United States has a prison industry, and it's not just the government, but we have private companies that are huge and make a lot of money.
Kids literally get a ticket for chewing gum in class or for talking too loudly, and they then have to go to court.
It just seems like we have over-criminalized things, and then we have over-responded disproportionately to things that even should be crime.
We can push them out, put them in prison, they will get out, and they will have learned nothing.
I know CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News have taken some knocks lately, but the fact is I admire their commitment to cover all sides of a story, just in case one of them happens to be accurate.
That was funny, but it's closer to the truth than you might think. Because when politicians and the mainstream media work side by side, the joke is actually on you. At RT News, we have a different approach.
LOL.
Because the news of the world just is not this funny.
I'm not laughing, damn it, I'm not laughing.
You guys stick to the jokes, we'll handle the news.
Dramas that can't be ignored. Stories others refuse to notice. Faces changing the world right now. A full picture of today's news. Live, on demand, from around the globe. Rockley.tv.
Right from the scene. First-rate news and eye-gripping pictures. On our reporters' Twitter and Instagram. To be in the know, follow us online.
Reporting from Tripoli, Syria, China, Germany, Korea, Amini Sinawe, and Washington. RT.
And we're back with Ray McGovern, retired analyst, whistleblower, political activist. Great to have you back. Right, so there's $5 billion that's been invested in Ukraine through the National Endowment for Democracy over the years. Do you believe Washington has the result it was actually looking for?
Well, it was a good try. In other words, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, apparently thought if she gave out chocolate chip cookies on the Maidan, that everything would turn out all right with Yats coming in as the interim prime minister. Now, Yats did become the interim prime minister, but not everything turned out all right, and she should have known better. And I think she did know better, and that's why I keep saying that her ultimate intention was to create a very hostile environment between Moscow and Washington.
But I mean, I think you're referring to the conversation that we've all heard between Victoria Nuland when she was actually laying out the plan of how the Ukrainian government should look. It does seem like it looks a lot like what she wanted it to look, no? Or is it a coincidence?
Well, it does for the nonce, for the time being. One would have thought that once that conversation, which shows direct American meddling in Ukrainian affairs, once that was on YouTube, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind would have prevented Yatsenyuk from becoming prime minister, but it didn't. That's how blatant it was. And that's why I say that it's just as much an effort to create enmity between our two countries.
Establishing legitimacy in Kyiv's greatest challenge now at home and abroad, especially in Moscow. But how can it achieve that, keeping in mind the striking similarity of the government lineup with Mrs. Nuland's instructions?
Well, I don't think Mrs. Nuland's going to have the final say here. I think everybody's interests need to be respected, and that's why I welcome so much the idea of Russia, the United States, the EU, and the Ukrainians sitting down at a table to work it out. It's not terribly complicated once the United States gives up the idea of regime change. My favorite outcome is to make the Ukraine something like Finland, where it could be neutral and a threat to no one, where NATO wouldn't go near the Ukraine. I think Russia would be satisfied with that.
Victoria Nuland was also heard to dismiss EU's role in this whole crisis. Has Ukraine caused a rift between European NATO members and Washington?
Well, she used a very vulgar term, which I won't repeat on air here. But you know, what surprises me still, and I've been watching this for over half a century, is how servile the West Europeans and the East Europeans are to Washington's demands. I think that's a transitory thing now, and I think this crisis will make the West Europeans, particularly the Germans, think twice about whether they should always say, how high do you want me to jump, when Washington says jump.
NATO's Secretary General also warned Russia against a historic mistake in Ukraine, threatening to further isolate Russia internationally. But what more can be done? I mean, they already suspended all cooperation.
Он несерьезный человек. That fellow, Fogh Rasmussen, is not a serious person. He was the guy that said on March the 18th, one day before the invasion of Iraq, we don't believe there are weapons of mass destruction there. We know they are there. He was at that point Prime Minister of Denmark. He is not a serious person. Don't pay any attention to him.
But he may change in the years to come, and another head of NATO will arise. But do you think it's still in NATO's plans to actually eventually take Ukraine in as a member state?
I think that what's just happened over the last couple of months should spell the death knell to NATO's plans to incorporate Ukraine. It may take a little while for that to sink in, but that's clearly the outcome of all this. And they will have, whether they will reverse their Bucharest Declaration of 6 years ago or not, on paper is another question. But I think sober-minded people in Europe, if not in the United States, have realized this was a bridge too far. This was one regime change too many, and that the Russians are not going to permit, are certainly not going to permit, Ukraine to become part of NATO.
And what about this whole sanctions business? There's a lot of talk about who it's going to hurt more. Is it worth introducing sanctions when you consider the likelihood of boomerang effect?
Boomerang? Well, you know, this is a real consideration. Here, in my view, the Russians have all the high cards. You've got the natural gas deliveries, not only through the Ukraine and to the Ukraine, but to the rest of Europe. You've got oil. You've got lots of factors at play, the very close trade relationships that exist now that did not exist 20 years ago. So these sanctions are, in many respects, laughable. And when they become, or if the U.S. presses for more serious sanctions, they will meet very strong resistance from countries like Germany, countries that are very important in Europe.
What about the political dialogue in general? Can the West afford to stop political dialogue with Russia?
Well, you know, there's the outward dialogue between Kerry and Sergei Lavrov. Kerry is fulminating. He's acting like a senator that has all kinds of power, but he doesn't have a lot of power. And just as what happened in Syria, Obama and Putin, thank goodness, slava Bogu, have a personal relationship. And as with Syria, Obama can go behind Kerry's back, deal directly with Vladimir Putin, and I see great hope in that.
And if we get back to sanctions just a little bit, you've called them laughable, and some would say that there's only been a token effort to introduce them. So does this all mean this is just hot air to impress voters?
Yes, I'd say большой шум, a lot of hot air, and a lot of, you know, this is playing to domestic constituencies. Obama wants to appear like he's taking a strong stand here, but the more he resorts to these token sanctions, the more transparent it is that he really doesn't have a lot of leverage here, and he should have known that going in. He was, in a large sense, mousetrapped by the neocons as they almost mousetrapped him into a war with Syria.
We're really impressed by your knowledge of Russian. Our foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, says American mercenaries are now active on the ground in eastern Ukraine, something in the U.S. is saying it cannot confirm. Would this surprise you?
It wouldn't surprise me. I guess what surprised me is that Lavrov most recently said, well, he accepts the assurances of Kerry that this is not the case. If it is the case, this would be sumasshedshie on the part of, it would be crazy on the part of the Americans. You know, one thing I'd point out here is that the press is ridiculous on our side of the ocean here. They talked, for example, about the pro-Russian Ukrainians singing Katyusha, Katyusha from World War II, okay? And everybody in the United States says, oh, those are those rockets. But they don't know it's a love song. Расцветали яблони и груши, поплыли туманы над рекой. You know the rest of it.
Yeah, I know the rest. Not only you know the Russian, you also sing well.
Well, thank you. I'll sing the rest of it later if you wish.
But, okay, if we get back to Ukraine, do you feel like Ukraine's forces need help in containing protests in the east? Or can they handle it on their own?
Well, I think they can. I think that there's probably some reason to believe that what Kerry and the White House spokesman are saying is that the Russians have a great deal of assets, a great deal of influence in what happens in the eastern Ukraine. And I would think that if people sit down at the table, this would be one of the cards in play. We will not stir up problems or trouble in the eastern Ukraine, and you will not put Blackwater or whatever they call themselves these days in the western Ukraine. It is all eminently workoutable. It just has to involve mature adult negotiators, which are at a premium, at least on our side.
And what are your thoughts about U.S. Navy deployments in the Black Sea?
Well, you know, we talk about pre-planned deployments, and as you know, the Treaty of Montreux allows these kinds of things. So I think that it's another gesture where, you know, Kerry can say, oh, we have some warships right there in the Black Sea. I don't take it very seriously. I would be surprised if the U.S. Navy were not ordered to show the flag in the Black Sea at this point.
Mm-hmm. And 2013 has actually been a really good year in U.S.-Russia relations, if you think about it, because, you know, they had this accord on Iran movement. Also, you mentioned Syria. I mean, President Obama and Putin were able to come to an agreement, a common deal. Do you think all that is just ruined right now?
I think there is great incentive on the part of the so-called neocons in our government to wreck that. But I don't think they're going to succeed. There is going to be a period of less cordial relationships, but now that we're sitting down at the table, I see that this will come back into proper focus. And I don't think Obama is so dumb that he will jettison the relationship that he has with Vladimir Putin, which Putin said in September of last year was marked by, quote, growing trust, end quote. I think there is a modicum of trust there, and I think Obama realizes by this point that he probably puts more trust eastward than in the neocons that want to get him into a peck of trouble in Syria and elsewhere.
All right, thank you very much for this great insight. Ray McGovern, retired CIA analyst turned whistleblower. We're talking about Ukraine, whether it's an internal or external problem, and also, will President Obama and Putin continue to collaborate on certain issues? It's been great having you with us today. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. We'll see you next time.